Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this morning's Morning 4321. Our text is going to be Genesis chapter 19. Genesis chapter 19. As my grandmother down in Mississippi used to say, this is where the chickens come home to roost. This is a sad build-up, really, that began in chapter 14, really chapter 13, of the whole story of Abraham and Lot. In chapter 19, Lot is firmly established within the city of Sodom, but judgment is going to come to the city of Sodom. In chapter 18, Abraham went through this, it sounds almost like a bargaining process with God to try to see if 10 righteous people could be found, God would spare the city. We find, as we come to chapter 19, 10 righteous people cannot be found. The city is ungodly. Lot's in the middle of it. Lot at the very beginning has two angels who come to him disguised as men. He tries to offer hospitality, try to keep them safe because he knows the character of the people around him. He's not able to. The people try to take these two. And that begins the whole unfolding of the destruction of the city of Sodom. And the city is destroyed. Sodom and Lot and his family try to get out. You have the sad story of Lot's wife, who is still so tied to the city that though they were commanded, you cannot look back when you leave the city. Just leave, forget about it, move on. Don't even look back. She looks back and she loses her life. In verses 23 through verse 28, we find, the sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Verses 27 through verse 29, Abraham is looking upon the situation. We find Abram went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, and he looked in, behold, the smoke of the land went up like a smoke from a furnace. God carried out his threat and punished as he said. Sadly enough, too, the chapter ends with a very disturbing story of Lot and his two daughters. His two daughters have been so influenced by the culture in which they lived. When they thought they were the only ones living, the solution to them was to get their father drunk and have sexual relations with him so that in their mind humanity can continue. The two children that are born will have long-lasting effects upon God's people moving forward. Guys, what do you see?
In the midst of this wickedness and this judgment visited upon the people, there is a number of rays of hope, if you will. One of the great two verses to me in this text is found in verses 15 and 16. It says, when morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he hesitated. So the men seized his hands and the hand of his wife and the hands of his two daughters, for the compassion of the Lord was upon him. And they brought him out and put him outside the city. I think there's a direct correlation to the book of Jude. In the book of Jude, Jude tells us how to interact with people, and it says in verse 23, we are to save others, snatching them out of the fire. And I think as I think about those two ideas together, it just says that we ought to have compassion like the Lord. When we see people in danger, even if they're hesitating, to try to reach out and grab them and pull them from the danger. That's what the Lord did for Lot. That's what we're to do for others in our lives.
Amen.
I wanted to think about what verse 29 says. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. What we know about Lot was that he was a righteous man who was living in an extremely unrighteous place. And what verse 29 tells us is that when God destroyed this place, he brought Lot out because he remembered Abraham. It wasn't because Lot was so righteous. It was because God remembered Abraham. And I think there's a couple of implications from that. First of all, the high regard and love that God had for Abraham. But secondly, the compassion of God, like David talked about. God was compassionate on Lot. I think sometimes we think that we can earn our salvation based off of our merit, and that's just absolutely not the truth. It all comes from the compassion and the love of God, and I think we need to remember that.
Amen. Thanks a lot, guys, for those two wonderful lessons. Thank you for joining us. You may have some applications or some things that you saw in chapter 19. Jot those down in the comments. Let's talk about that a little bit. Thanks a lot. Have a